I should have gone home at 10 o'clock. That is the thought that still wakes me up some nights. The smell of wet soil clung to my clothes as I moved through the greenhouse with a basket of pruning tools balanced against my hip. Outside, the last traces of sunset had disappeared behind the rolling hills of the estate. The property stretched for hundreds of acres beyond the gardens, forests, and stone walls. Most people in town simply called it Russo land. I called it work. For the past 3 years, I had cared for the flowers, trimmed hedges, planted seasonal beds, and spent more time talking to roses than to actual people. It was a quiet life, a predictable life, exactly the kind I liked. The greenhouse lights reflected against the glass panels above me while rain tapped softly against the roof. My shift had ended nearly 2 hours earlier, but a shipment of orchids had arrived late that afternoon, and I could never leave delicate plants unattended. My supervisor would probably tell me I cared too much. Maybe he was right. I checked the temperature controls one last time before setting down my tools. The silence felt different. Not alarming, just strange. The estate was always quiet after dark, but tonight the air seemed heavier somehow. I stepped outside and locked the greenhouse door behind me. Cool night air brushed against my face. The scent of damp earth filled the gardens. Usually, the path back to my cottage felt peaceful. That small cottage sat near the edge of the property, surrounded by wildflowers and old oak trees. It was simple, affordable, mine. At least, that was how I thought of it. I adjusted my jacket and started walking. Then I saw the light. At first, I thought it was a vehicle. A pair of headlights maybe. But this light moved differently. It flickered between the trees beyond the eastern garden. White, then gone, then visible again. I stopped walking. The woods beyond that section of land were private. No hiking trails. No public access. Nobody should have been there at this hour. I listened carefully. Nothing. Only the distant rustling of leaves. My phone showed 10:17 p.m. I should have turned around. I should have gone straight home and forgotten the whole thing. Instead, curiosity won. The light appeared again deeper in the trees. My pulse quickened. I took a few cautious steps toward the edge of the garden. The estate looked completely different at night. The flower beds became shadows. The statues looked like silent figures standing watch. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out. The light disappeared once more. Then I heard something else. An engine. Low. Expensive. Not one vehicle. Several. My stomach tightened. Nobody in town drove through these woods after dark. Nobody except the people who own them. I moved closer to the tree line, trying to see through the darkness. That was when another light appeared farther ahead. Then another. And suddenly I realized I was not looking at headlights. I was looking at black vehicles parked among the trees where no vehicles should have been. I thought the strangest thing on the property that night was the light I saw in the woods. I was wrong. The sensible part of my brain told me to leave immediately. Unfortunately, curiosity had always been my worst habit. I stood at the edge of the tree line staring through the darkness while cool night air drifted through the branches overhead. The lights between the trees flickered again. More clearly this time. Not random. Organized. Deliberate. Whoever was out there wanted the vehicles hidden from the main roads. My pulse quickened. I took another step forward. Then another. Wet leaves crunched softly beneath my boots. The deeper I moved into the woods, the quieter the world became. The sounds of the greenhouse disappeared behind me. Even the wind seemed to fade. All I could hear was the distant hum of engines. After a minute of walking, the trees thinned enough for me to see a small clearing ahead. I stopped instantly. For black SUVs sat beneath towering pine trees. Their headlights were off. Only a few low exterior lights illuminated the area. Several men stood near the vehicles wearing dark coats. They were not shouting. They were not arguing. In fact, the entire scene felt strangely calm. Yet every instinct told me this was not something an ordinary employee was supposed to witness. I ducked behind a tree and watched. One of the men opened the rear door of the center vehicle. Another checked his watch. Nobody seemed nervous. They looked like people waiting for someone important to arrive. My phone vibrated suddenly in my jacket pocket. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I grabbed it immediately and silenced the call. My friend Lily. The screen glow flashed brighter than I expected. For one horrifying second, I thought everyone in the clearing would see it. I held my breath. Nothing happened. The men continued their conversation. I exhaled slowly. Then headlights appeared farther down a hidden service road. A fifth vehicle approached. Unlike the others, This one traveled alone. The men in the clearing immediately straightened. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed instructions. Respect moved through the group like a silent wave. The vehicle rolled to a stop. The rear passenger door opened. A man stepped out. I could not see his face clearly from where I stood. Only pieces of him. Dark coat, polished shoes, broad shoulders, calm movements. Yet something changed the moment he arrived. The atmosphere shifted. The men who had seemed confident seconds earlier suddenly became more attentive, more careful. Whoever this man was, he carried authority without saying a word. I watched him greet several people before walking toward the center of the clearing. The conversation that followed remained too quiet for me to hear. Frustration tugged at me. I leaned slightly farther around the tree. Maybe one more step would give me a better angle. My boot caught a fallen branch. Crack. The sound exploded through the silence. Every muscle in my body locked. The conversation stopped instantly. I froze. For a moment, nobody moved. Then one of the men turned toward the woods. Another followed. My heart slammed against my ribs. No. No, no, no. Slowly, several heads pivoted in my direction. I stepped backward. Leaves shifted beneath my feet again. The sound seemed deafening. The man who had arrived last finally looked toward the trees. Even from this distance, I felt it. Attention. Focus. The weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I could not see his eyes clearly, but somehow I knew he was staring directly at me. Every survival instinct I possessed suddenly came alive. I turned and hurried deeper into the darkness. Branches brushed against my jacket. My breathing grew uneven. Behind me, I heard no shouting, no footsteps. Somehow that frightened me even more. Then a deep voice carried calmly through the trees. Not loud, not angry, just certain. Whoever is out there, the man said, stop running. I should have kept going. Instead, for reasons I still cannot explain, I stopped. I stopped because the voice did not sound angry. It did not sound rushed either. Somehow that made it impossible to ignore. My heart still pounded against my ribs as I stood among the trees staring into the darkness ahead. For several seconds, nobody moved. The clearing remained quiet. The engines hummed softly in the background. Somewhere above me, rainwater dripped from a branch. Then the man stepped forward. He emerged from the light slowly enough that I could finally see him clearly. Tall, dark hair, black coat tailored so perfectly it looked expensive even in the shadows. His expression remained calm. Not friendly, not threatening, simply controlled. He stopped a few yards away and studied me. I suddenly became very aware of how ridiculous I looked. Mud on my boots, dirt beneath my fingernails, gardening gloves still hanging from my jacket pocket. I spent my days planting flowers. This man looked like he spent his days deciding the fate of companies. Or cities. Or both. You work here, he said. It was not a question. I nodded. Yes. His eyes moved briefly to my jacket. The estate logo was stitched onto the chest. How long? 3 years. Another small nod. The men behind him remained silent. Nobody interrupted. Nobody seemed surprised that he was leading the conversation. The realization made me uneasy. I am sorry, I blurted out. I was not trying to spy on anyone. One eyebrow lifted slightly. No. Heat rushed into my cheeks. Okay, maybe a little. To my horror, the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. Close enough to make me forget my fear for half a second. Honesty is usually a good strategy. I folded my arms, mostly to stop my hands from shaking. I saw lights, and curiosity won. Yes, that happens. The answer surprised me. I had expected suspicion, maybe frustration. Instead, he sounded almost amused. A cold breeze moved through the trees. The man glanced toward the clearing before looking back at me. What exactly did you see? The question immediately brought back my anxiety. I thought carefully. Not much. Explain. Vehicles. I pointed toward the clearing. People talking. His expression never changed. Anything else? I shook my head. No. That was the truth. I had not heard their conversation. I had not seen documents or exchanged packages or anything dramatic. Just people meeting in the woods. The man studied my face for several seconds. Long enough to make me wonder if he believed me. Finally, he nodded. Good. Relief washed through me. Then another thought arrived. Who are you? Several men behind him exchanged quick glances. Apparently, I had asked a question most people did not ask. The stranger seemed more interested than offended. You do not know? Should I? Another almost smile appeared. This time it lasted slightly longer. Probably. Before he could answer, one of the men approached. Sir, that single word changed everything. Not because of what it meant. Because of how it was spoken. Respect. Loyalty. Absolute certainty. The stranger turned slightly. What is it? The man lowered his voice. I could not hear the response. I watched the exchange anyway. Every person in the clearing seemed focused on him, waiting for his reaction, waiting for his decision. Authority surrounded him like an invisible force. When the conversation ended, he looked back at me. What is your name? Emma Carter. Emma. My name sounded different in his voice. More deliberate somehow. You live in the caretaker cot. Every person in town knew the name Damien Russo. Nobody talked about him loudly. Nobody asked unnecessary questions. He owned businesses, land, buildings, and apparently enough influence to become the subject of endless rumors. Yet standing in front of him felt different from hearing stories. Stories never mentioned how calm he was. They never mentioned the strange way he listened before speaking. I stared at him while my brain desperately tried to catch up with reality. You are Damien Russo. Brilliant observation, Emma. Truly. His smile widened slightly. That is usually my name. One of the men behind him looked like he was trying very hard not to laugh. Heat climbed into my cheeks. Fantastic. I had somehow embarrassed myself in front of the most powerful man on the property. Damien seemed completely unbothered by it. He glanced toward the clearing and then back at me. You should not be out here alone. The comment caught me off guard. I work here. You work in the gardens, which are on the property. Not this part. I looked around. Tall trees surrounded us in every direction. What exactly is this part? His expression became unreadable again. Private. The answer somehow created more questions than it solved. I folded my arms. You know that is not an actual explanation. It is the explanation you are getting. I opened my mouth to argue and immediately stopped. There was no point. The man practically owned the horizon. Arguing with him about property boundaries seemed unlikely to change anything. Damien studied me for another moment. Were you planning to tell anyone what you saw? The question immediately pulled me back to the real issue. I did not see anything. One eyebrow lifted. You were watching us. I saw vehicles. I pointed toward the clearing. And people standing around talking. His gaze remained fixed on mine. That is all. Yes. The truth sounded surprisingly convincing because it happened to be true. Damien nodded once. Whatever he saw in my face seemed to satisfy him. Relief washed through me. Then a new problem arrived. My phone buzzed again. Loudly. The sound shattered the quiet woods. I glanced down. Lily. Again. 3 missed calls. 2 text messages. 1 voicemail. Damien noticed my expression. Someone worried about you? My best friend. You should call her back. I blinked. That was not the response I expected. Really, people who care about you should not spend the night wondering if you are safe. For a second, the comment felt strangely personal. Then the moment disappeared. One of the men approached Damien. Sir, we need to leave soon. Damien nodded without looking away from me. The man stepped back immediately. I watched the exchange. The loyalty around him fascinated me. Nobody questioned him. Nobody interrupted him. The entire group moved according to some invisible rhythm centered around one person. Damien finally glanced toward the clearing. You should go home, Emma. Home sounded wonderful. My small cottage. My old couch. My collection of gardening books. A world that made sense. I started to nod. Then another question slipped out before I could stop it. Why meet out here? The woods suddenly became very quiet. Several men exchanged looks. I immediately regretted asking. Damien regarded me calmly. Because privacy is valuable. Fair answer. Frustrating answer. But fair. He took a step closer. Not enough to feel threatening. Just enough to ensure I paid attention. And because sometimes people see things they were never supposed to see. My pulse quickened. The words were not hostile. If anything, they sounded almost thoughtful. Then his eyes moved briefly toward the estate beyond the trees. Fortunately for you, he said quietly. I think tonight was mostly an accident. Before I could ask what that meant, headlights appeared deeper along the service road. Another vehicle approached the clearing. Damien's expression changed instantly. The warmth vanished. The calm remained, but something sharper settled beneath it. He looked toward the arriving vehicle and then back at me. Emma. The way he said my name made me straighten immediately. What? His gaze locked onto mine. Go home. Now. And for the first time since meeting him, I did not think it was a suggestion. The moment Damien said it, I obeyed. That alone should have worried me. I had spent my entire life making my own decisions. Yet something in his voice cut through every instinct to argue. I turned toward the path leading back to the gardens and started walking. Not running. Not because I was brave. Because I refused to look frightened in front of a man who seemed capable of reading every expression on my face. The farther I moved from the clearing, the louder my thoughts became. What exactly had I stumbled into? Why had another vehicle arriving changed Damien's mood so quickly? And why did the idea of leaving feel strangely unfinished? The woods gradually opened into familiar garden paths. Rows of hydrangeas lined the stone walkway. The greenhouse lights glowed softly in the distance. Everything looked exactly as it had an hour earlier. Yet nothing felt the same. My phone buzzed again. This time I answered. Emma. Lily practically shouted into the speaker. Do you have any idea how worried I have been? I winced. Sorry, she repeated. You disappeared for 2 hours and stopped answering your phone. I was working. Technically true. Mostly true. At 10 o'clock at night? I glanced back toward the woods. Long story. Lily sighed dramatically. Fine. Tomorrow. Coffee. Full explanation. Deal. After ending the call, I continued toward my cottage. The small house sat beneath a cluster of old oak trees near the eastern edge of the estate. White siding, green shutters, a tiny porch covered in flower pots. It was not impressive, but it felt like home. Usually. Tonight, as I unlocked the front door, a strange thought crossed my mind. Damien had known exactly where I lived. The realization should not have surprised me. He owned the property, yet it still felt unsettling. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. The familiar scent of lavender candles and potting soil greeted me. I dropped my gardening gloves onto the kitchen counter and kicked off my boots. Then I walked straight to the window overlooking the distant gardens. Darkness stretched across the estate. Nothing moved. No lights. No vehicles. If I had not experienced the evening myself, I might have convinced myself it never happened. I made tea, sat on the couch, tried reading, failed. Every few minutes, my thoughts drifted back to Damien Rousseau. The stories people told about him never matched the man I had met. Rumors described someone cold and untouchable. Yet he had told me to call my friend back. He had worried about me walking through the woods alone. None of it fit together. Around midnight, exhaustion finally began to win. I carried my empty mug into the kitchen and switched off the lights. That was when I noticed something outside. A vehicle, parked beyond the trees near the access road. My heartbeat quickened immediately. The vehicle remained motionless, dark, almost invisible. Maybe it belonged to estate security. Maybe not. I stood at the window for nearly a minute. Then headlights flashed once. Briefly, deliberately. Not an accident. A signal. Before I could process what it meant, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. I hesitated before answering. Hello. Silence greeted me. Then a familiar voice. Calm. Controlled. Impossible to mistake. Lock your doors, Emma. Every muscle in my body tightened. I moved toward the window again. The vehicle was gone. Damien, I asked. What is happening? A pause followed. Longer than I liked. Nothing is wrong, he said, which immediately told me something was. I gripped the phone tighter. Then why are you calling me after midnight? Another pause. Then his voice softened slightly. Because you live on my land, garden girl. My pulse skipped. And the answer came quietly. Certain. As though it was the simplest fact in the world. That means your safety is my responsibility now. For several seconds after the call ended, I stood motionless in my dark kitchen staring at my reflection in the window. The words echoed through my mind. Your safety is my responsibility now. Nobody had ever spoken to me like that before. Not because it sounded romantic. It did not. It sounded like a statement. A decision he had already made. I checked every lock in the cottage twice before finally going to bed. Sleep, however, refused to cooperate. Every creak of the old house made me glance toward the door. Every passing set of headlights beyond the distant road made me sit up. By the time sunlight finally filtered through my curtains, I felt like I had slept for 10 minutes instead of 8 hours. The next morning, the estate looked completely normal. Dew covered the flower beds. Birds moved between the hedges. Gardeners unloaded equipment near the western greenhouse. If I had not received that midnight phone call, I might have convinced myself the entire night had been a strange dream. I grabbed my coffee and headed toward the rose gardens. Work had always been my solution to everything. Heartbreak, stress, anxiety. Flowers demanded attention. They did not care about mysterious meetings in the woods. Around 9 o'clock, I noticed something unusual. Two unfamiliar men stood near the entrance road. They wore simple jackets and baseball caps, trying very hard to look ordinary. The problem was that ordinary people did not spend 20 minutes staring at flower beds without actually looking at the flowers. I frowned and continued working. An hour later, they were still there. By lunchtime, they had moved closer to the eastern section of the property, closer to my cottage. A knot formed in my stomach. Maybe Damien had been right. Maybe something really had changed after that night. I tried ignoring it until my supervisor approached carrying a clipboard. Emma. Morning, Frank. He scratched the back of his neck. Apparently you have a meeting. I blinked. A meeting? At the main house. Every gardener on the property would have found that strange. Employees did not get invited to the main house. Not unless something had gone very wrong. With who? I asked, already knowing the answer. Frank gave me a look. Mr. Russo. Wonderful. 30 minutes later, I found myself standing in front of the largest house I had ever seen up close. I had worked on the estate for years, but seeing the mansion from the gardens and standing at its entrance were two completely different experiences. Stone columns framed the front doors. Massive windows reflected the afternoon sky. The place looked less like a home and more like something that belonged in a movie. A woman in a tailored navy suit greeted me and escorted me inside. Marble floors stretched beneath my feet. Paintings lined the walls. Everything felt expensive enough to make me nervous. She led me into a sunlit office overlooking the eastern gardens. Damien stood near the windows with a cup of coffee in one hand. He turned when I entered. His expression softened slightly. Garden girl. I rolled my eyes. Please tell me that is not becoming my official name. A faint smile appeared. It is growing on me. I crossed my arms. You called me here to discuss nicknames? No. The smile vanished. His gaze shifted toward the windows. I called you here because the men watching the property this morning were not mine. Every trace of humor disappeared from my face. Watching the property? Damien nodded. And they have been asking questions about you. My pulse quickened instantly. Why? He looked directly at me. Calm. Focused. Serious. That is exactly what I intend to find out. For a moment, I forgot about the office, the mansion, and the view beyond the windows. All I could focus on was the sentence hanging between us. People were asking questions about me. That does not make any sense, I said. Damien remained calm. I agree. I am a gardener. You are also the only unexpected variable from that night. I stared at him. The logic was difficult to argue with. Uncomfortable, but difficult to argue with. Damien walked back toward his desk and picked up a folder. He opened it and studied several pages before closing it again. The questions started yesterday morning. My stomach tightened. What kind of questions? Where you live? How long you have worked here? Who you spend time with? A chill ran through me. None of those sounded harmless. I crossed my arms. And how do you know this? One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. Because people ask questions around me too. Fair point. I looked toward the gardens outside the window. Tiny figures moved between rows of flowers far below. My normal life suddenly felt very far away. What exactly happened that night? I asked quietly. Damien's expression became thoughtful. You mean in the woods? Yes. He was silent for several seconds. A meeting. I figured that part out. Another faint smile appeared. Then you are making progress. I rolled my eyes. To my surprise, the reaction seemed to amuse him. Damien. Emma. I am serious. A woman stepped inside carrying a tablet. Sir. Damien turned toward her. What is it? The vehicle from this morning has returned. The atmosphere changed instantly. Not dramatically. I suddenly felt very aware of how large the mansion was and how small my cottage seemed by comparison. Damien looked toward the window again. I sighed. Damien, this is ridiculous. Probably. Then why are we discussing it? His expression softened slightly. Because I would rather have you annoyed with me than unsafe. The answer caught me completely off guard. There was no manipulation in his voice. No dramatic declaration. Just simple honesty. The kind that was difficult to argue against. I looked away first. Outside, clouds drifted across the afternoon sky. This is temporary? I asked quietly. Very. One night. We will start there. I should have refused. Every independent part of me wanted to refuse. Yet the image of those unfamiliar men near my cottage kept returning. So did the memory of the vehicle outside my window. Finally, I exhaled. Fine. Relief flashed across his face so quickly I almost missed it. Good. I pointed a finger at him. Do not look so pleased with yourself. That earned a genuine smile. The first real one I had seen all day. Too late. And for the first time since walking into the mansion, I realized something unexpected. Damien Russo looked far less concerned about whatever was happening outside the estate than he did about me walking back to that cottage alone. By late afternoon, I found myself carrying an overnight bag through hallways larger than my entire cottage. The situation felt ridiculous. 24 hours earlier, my biggest concern had been protecting a shipment of orchids from a temperature change. Now I was temporarily living inside Damien Russo's mansion because strangers were asking questions about me. A woman named Victoria showed me to a guest suite overlooking the eastern gardens. The room alone was larger than my living room, kitchen, and bedroom combined. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed rows of roses stretching toward the horizon. Fresh flowers sat on a polished table near the fireplace. Somehow that detail made the room feel less intimidating. I thanked Victoria after she left and immediately walked to the window. From here, I could see my entire section of the estate. Tiny paths wound through flower beds I had spent years caring for. The view should have been comforting. Instead, it reminded me how quickly life could change. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Damien stood in the doorway holding 2 coffee mugs. I was told gardeners require caffeine. I stared at him. You brought me coffee? Do not sound so surprised. I accepted the mug. You own a mansion. And people with mansions usually have other people bring coffee. A faint smile appeared. I like knowing it was made correctly. I laughed despite myself. The tension that had followed me all day eased slightly. Damien stepped toward the window and looked out at the gardens. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt surprisingly comfortable. Finally, I asked the question that had been bothering me for hours. Why do you care? His gaze remained fixed outside. About what? About me. The answer arrived slower than I expected. Because this started with me. I studied his profile. The meeting? He nodded once. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. That still does not explain everything. Damien exhaled quietly. No, it does not. He turned toward me. The usual confidence remained, but something else was there now. Fatigue. Concern. Maybe both. The people asking questions are trying to understand what happened that night. And what happened? A business discussion. I waited. He did not continue. That is all. That is all. I narrowed my eyes. You are leaving something out. To my surprise, he nodded. Probably. The honesty caught me completely off guard. Before I could respond, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. The warmth disappeared from his expression almost immediately. Not anger. Focus. The transformation was fascinating. 1 second, he was standing beside me discussing coffee. The next, he looked like the man everyone in town whispered about. He answered the call and listened silently. After less than a minute, he ended it. Good news? I asked. Potentially. That sounds suspicious. One corner of his mouth lifted. Fair. He walked toward the door, then stopped. Emma. I looked up. What? His expression softened again. The people from this morning have left. Relief rushed through me so quickly I nearly sat down. Really? Yes. For the first time all day, I felt like I could breathe normally. Damien watched my reaction carefully. You see, he said quietly. Sometimes caution works. I shook my head. You are impossible. The smile returned. Genuine this time. I hear that often. After he left, I stood alone beside the window and watched the sunset spread across the gardens. Golden light settled over every flower bed. Everything looked peaceful, safe. Yet something about Damien's phone call continued to bother me. Not what he said, what he did not say. Because when he mentioned the strangers leaving, relief had crossed his face. But beneath that relief, I had seen something else. The look of a man who knew a larger storm was still coming. The next morning arrived with unexpected quiet. Sunlight poured across the gardens outside my temporary room, turning the roses gold and making the previous 2 days feel almost unreal. Almost. I stood beside the window holding a cup of coffee and watched workers move through the estate below. Everything appeared normal, peaceful, yet I knew better now. Some storms were invisible. Around 9 o'clock, Victoria informed me that breakfast was being served on the terrace. The idea of eating breakfast in a place that looked like a luxury resort still felt ridiculous, but hunger eventually convinced me. I followed the winding hallway toward the rear terrace overlooking the eastern gardens. Damien was already there. He sat at the far end of the table reading documents while a cup of coffee cooled beside him. The morning breeze moved through the ivy, climbing the stone walls. For a few seconds, he looked less like the man everyone feared and more like someone carrying too much responsibility. He glanced up when I approached. "You slept." It was not a question. Eventually, a faint smile appeared. "Progress." I sat across from him. Are the mysterious strangers still gone? For now. The answer should have reassured me. Instead, it made me nervous. Damien noticed immediately. "You are learning." That does not sound encouraging. It is not supposed to. I shook my head and reached for a piece of toast. Somewhere over the past 48 hours, our conversations had become strangely easy, unexpectedly normal. That realization should have bothered me more than it did. We ate in comfortable silence for several minutes before I finally asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind. What really happened that night? Damien lowered the document in his hand. The answer has not changed. Then maybe I am asking the wrong question. His attention sharpened slightly. I continued. "Why did you trust me?" That seemed to surprise him. Of all the things I could have asked, I suspect he expected something else. "Trust you," he repeated. "You met me in the woods." "Exactly." I leaned back in my chair. "You did not know me." Damien looked toward the gardens stretching across the property. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "Because you looked terrified of getting caught." I blinked. "That is your reason?" "Yes." "That is not a very good reason." One corner of his mouth lifted. "Perhaps not." He folded his hands. "But people hiding dangerous secrets usually worry about themselves." "You worried about getting in trouble." I stared at him. The answer was absurdly simple. Yet somehow it made sense. Before I could respond, a familiar voice called my name. I turned. Frank, my supervisor, was crossing the terrace carrying a small box. He looked relieved to see me. "Emma." "Frank." He handed me the box. Inside sat a collection of handwritten thank you notes from several local families whose community garden project I had helped organize months earlier. I smiled immediately. I forgot these were arriving. Frank nodded. "The kids wanted to make sure you got them." After he left, I looked through the cards one by one. Crayon drawings, misspelled words, tiny messages thanking me for teaching them how flowers grow. By the time I finished, my eyes felt suspiciously warm. When I looked up, Damien was watching quietly. "What?" I asked. He glanced toward the cards. "Nothing." That was definitely not nothing. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. "You spend your life helping things grow." I laughed softly. That is the most gardener-specific compliment anyone has ever given me. The smile that followed reached his eyes this time. Real, unguarded. And suddenly I understood something important. The estate had never been what made people loyal to Damien Russo. It was not the money. It was not the power. Beneath everything else, he noticed people. Truly noticed them. The realization settled quietly inside me as sunlight spilled across the terrace and the gardens beyond. I had spent days believing I accidentally wandered into his world. But standing there beside him, watching the morning unfold, I realized something unexpected. For the first time since that night in the woods, I no longer wanted to leave it.